Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about my autumn and winter TBR. I love reading quite similar type books around the autumn and winter, so I thought I would smush them together. I was going to wait until the 22nd of September to upload this video because that is officially the first day of autumn, depending on what calendar you follow. But firstly, in the last 2 days, the temperature has drastically dropped where I live, and I know a few people have put their heating on. I started wearing long sleeves and a jacket when I go out. Yesterday I put tights on and we had sausage and mash for dinner. So joy of all joys, starting to feel like autumn. And when I stepped out of the house yesterday evening at about 5:30, it smelled smoky. It had that kind of hint of autumn to the air. So I just kept laughing to myself all day yesterday with joy of it feeling like autumn. So that's one reason I'm doing this a little bit earlier than planned. And the other reason is that I've been working on this list for a few weeks. Pretty much most of my evenings, even if there's been something on the TV in the background, I've been like working away at this list, become very nerdy about it. And if I spent any more time on it, I was just going to add more books, and there is a limit to how many I can fit in one video. And I do like to do these as one video because that's how I like to watch them. So there's 35 books here. Themes are that I like reading in the autumn, obviously kind of spooky and gothic because of Halloween season. I also really like reading some cosy books this time of year, books that you kind of feel like you can curl up with on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of tea and a slice of cake on the sofa. I love to read books that are set in kind of remote settings, whether they be rural settings, coastal settings with that kind of rugged windswept landscape. Obviously love books set on islands because islands usually are more open to the elements, so I think they're really great for this time of year. And also I really like reading books that have kind of a small town feel to them and a very sort of slice of life focus, books that are focusing on the kind of minutiae of domestic life because we spend a lot of time indoors at this time of year, so I really like that. So I have a blend of all those things. I'm super happy with this list. I feel so excited about all these books. A few of them aren't out yet, so I'll note that when we get there. But yeah, I'm going to crack on. I tried to put these in some semblance of an order, so I'm starting with the more kind of spooky gothic type books. The first book is a slight cheat because this was on my TBR last year for the autumn and winter, and I haven't been able to get hold of a copy in the UK. So I wanted to keep it on my TBR because I wanted to, keep it at the front of my mind. And I also thought I could ask some of you if you have been able to locate it anywhere. And that is Moon of the Turning Leaves by Waubgeshig Rice. So this is the second book in what is currently a duology, but I don't know if there's going to be more. The first book was a novella and it was called Moon of the Crusted Snow. And I listened to it on audio. I really like the audiobook narrator, so I would like to carry on audio, but it still isn't available for me to listen to anywhere. And I had a look the other day to see if I could access it anywhere else and couldn't find it. But if you know of a way where in the UK I can access this on audio, please let me know. So the premise is, and I won't spoil anything, in the first book we are following a small Indigenous community that live in a remote area of northern Ontario. There is a kind of electrical blackout, so they stop being able to contact anybody. They can't use their phones or the internet. Fortunately, they have a generator, so they can use the generator. But as this persists, they start to realise that this is some type of world-affecting event, and they decide how to continue as a community. And there is this kind of threat looming because a group of white people arrive at their community, and realising they are much better prepared for this type of situation, ask to be let in. And it's kind of about what happens there. This next book, I think, is set a certain amount of years after the first book, and I am super intrigued to go back to these characters. I thought it was a really enjoyable book, highly recommend the first one. So yeah, I'd love to listen to this one. The next one is an Andrew Michael Hurley book. Now I've read one of his short stories and I actually really enjoyed it, but I haven't yet read any of his novels, and all of his novels are kind of folk British horror novels, so I don't know why I haven't read them. I've been pushed to pick this one up because there is actually a film adaptation of this one coming out quite soon called Starve Acre, and it stars Matt Smith and Morfydd Clark, both actors who I really enjoy, and the trailer looks amazing. And I don't usually mind seeing a film before I read the book, but I thought, this gives me that push to read this book. He actually also has a new book coming out this autumn, so that one also sounds pretty amazing, but I'm going to focus on Starvacre initially. So it says that there's this couple called Richard and Juliet, and their son sadly dies at the age of 5. In her grief, Juliet turns to a local group of occultists, I think to try and see if they can reach her son. Whereas Richard tries to forget, and in doing that, he starts to dig in a field across from the house, I think called Starvacre, where there is this legend of this hidden oak tree. And as he digs, he unearths some type of dark, looming presence. It says that this is a folk horror tale fueled by menace, guilt, and grief. It sounds amazing. All the reviews of it sound really, really good. And like I said, I really enjoyed his writing in that short story I read, so I think I'll enjoy this one. Next, we have The Burial Plot by Elizabeth McNeil. Now, she has a couple of books out previous to this one, and I've kept meaning to give one a go and have just never gotten around to it. But this one has pulled me in part because I think this sounds fairly reminiscent of Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, which I absolutely love. So if you've read Fingersmith, let me know if you think this blurb sounds a little bit reminiscent of it. I wonder whether Elizabeth McNeil is like a big fan of Fingersmith and wanted to kind of, reimagine it using some other plot devices. Because the premise of this, it says it is a spellbinding gothic thriller of murder and manipulation. Set in London in 1863, we follow a trickster duo called Bonnie and Crawford. A plan goes wrong, and so Bonnie needs to hide away. And so she is sent to a kind of fancy house near the Thames in London as a lady's maid. And it says, as Bonnie comes to understand the family, she begins to question what secrets are lying behind the paper-thin walls and whether her own presence here was planned from the beginning. Because Crawford is watching and perhaps he is plotting his greatest trick yet. So yeah, I think that sounds really intriguing. I really want to give this one a go. Then we have Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Wang. I've heard really good things about this. I'm a little bit anxious about this one because my understanding this has some elements of body horror. Not quite sure how good I am with body horror, but I'm going to give this one a go because I'm really intrigued by the premise. So it says this is a razor-sharp novel that follows a young musician into an elite, beauty-obsessed world where perfection comes at a staggering cost. It explores consumerism, self-worth, race and identity. And my understanding is that she's a Chinese-American immigrant and her parents are struggling financially, so she kind of leaves her music training behind and she joins this kind of big beauty company and starts to work for them. But as she starts to work for them, she starts to get very pulled in by their message, and I think some of their products maybe do some kind of weird and wacky things, and that's where the body horror comes in. So yeah, I've heard really interesting things about this one, and yeah, I'm intrigued to try books that are a bit more on the horror spectrum because I don't think I read many books like that. Then we have Grey Dog by Elliot Gish. I stumbled across this one, I think, on Everand when I was looking for audiobooks and was immediately pulled in by that cover. And as with all these books, I've read a sample of them. I've read the first few pages. As I said, the amount of books I had on this list was ridiculous, so I narrowed it down by reading samples. So I really enjoyed all these samples, and this was one that, yeah, I really remember even out of the 35, so I'm very intrigued by this one. We follow a woman called Ada Bird, which I think is a great name. In 1901, this is set in rural Canada, and she is a spinster, school mom, amateur naturalist, and she accepts a new position as a teacher in a tiny farming community. And as the novel opens, she's arriving there. But it says that this is a subversive literary horror novel that disrupts the tropes of women's historical fiction with delusions, wild beasts, and the uncontainable power of female rage. See, I think there's a lot of questioning going on here as to whether Ada is kind of mentally unwell and she's imagining some of these things she sees, or whether something else is happening and some type of kind of transformation is taking place. So yeah, very much intrigued by this one. And then we have Butter by Azeko Yuzuki. This was translated from the Japanese by Polly Barton. I've been hearing really interesting things about this one. And so yeah, I'm kind of intrigued to give it a go. So my understanding is that we have this kind of famous, really celebrated female gourmet chef, and she is in prison because she has killed, I think, a lot of the men she's been feeding. She's been killing them via her recipes, and she's refusing to talk to anybody until this female journalist writes her a letter and asks her for the recipe for her beef stew. She then starts to write back, and her own curiosity sort of gets the better of her, and so she agrees to tell her story to this journalist. It says this is a vivid, unsettling exploration of misogyny, obsession, romance, and the transgressible pleasures of food in Japan. So I'm really intrigued by this one. I've heard that this is, has been really making waves in Japan. And I quite like books that feature food as a key component. I think food writing can be done really beautifully. And I think talking about food in this kind of transgressive way could be really interesting. Then we have Bright I Burn by Molly Aitken. This is her second novel. I've read her first one, The Island Child. I really enjoyed it. I listened to it on audio, and I'll also be listening to this one on audio because it's set in 13th century Ireland, so I'm sure there will be a great narrator for this one. We're actually reading this for my Patreon book club in October. So I think it will be a really nice one to read and discuss in October because this is all about witchcraft. So the premise of this is that we follow this is a real story, this really happened, the first recorded person in Ireland to be condemned as a witch. This novel gives voice to a woman lost to history who dared to carve her own space in a man's world. The descriptions of this were amazing, like so many authors have blurbed this one and said how amazing it is, but some of the words that were used were incandescent, lustrous, a distinct lyrical voice, and what really pulled me in, spellbinding witch literature, which I think should be its own sort of sub-genre. So really intrigued by this one. And then while we're on the topic of witchiness, we have The Mercies by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. In large part, I've been intrigued to get to this one because it's set in a remote Norwegian island. It's set in 1617 and it's also inspired by real events. So I think all the men on this island are fishermen, and they are all out at sea one day when a big storm hits and there are no survivors. So I think the only men as such left on the island are young children, and then the rest of the residents are all women. Now these women manage to fare really well. They develop their own community and their own way of continuing without the men. But then this is heard about on the mainland. And so someone is sent to the island to try and get these women back in line. I think there's questions of kind of witchcraft, but he takes with him his young, innocent wife, and she very quickly befriends a lot of the women on the island, and I think there is going to be a sort of queer romance in here. And one thing I'll say about The Dance Tree is there was a queer romance in that, which was kind of forbidden, and there were so many scenes where I was like on the edge of my seat, fearing for their lives, thinking they were going to get caught. So I think I'll be in a similar situation with The Mercies. Then on the 24th of October, and there's quite a few books coming out on this date that I have on this TBR, we have First by Marina Yuzusuk. I apologise if I've said that right, I couldn't find a pronunciation online. This is translated from the Spanish by Heather Cleary. This is described as Latin American feminist Gothic, which immediately pulls me in. This book, I understand, is set in two time periods, one being the 19th century and the other being present day Buenos Aires. And we follow these two women who are struggling with fear, loneliness and mortality, and a haunting yearning that one will not let them rest. My understanding is I think both of these women might be vampires, or perhaps even like the same woman because she's immortal. I always think that's a kind of interesting concept of what you're discussing about vampires is the idea of immortality, how they live through the ages, how, anyone they know who isn't also a vampire, they will eventually lose to death, and the idea of how lonely that would feel and how much grief you would live with. So I'm very much intrigued by this one. I think it has a brilliant cover as well. And the last spooky one I have, or the last kind of outrightly spooky book, is A Good House for Children, which I think is quite an eerie title in and of itself, by Kate Collins. The Reeve House stands on the edge of the Dorset Cliffs, again that kind of rugged coastline feel, awaiting its next inhabitants. We follow Orla, which is a lovely name, in 2016 as she tries to raise her children there after her husband basically decides for them that they have to up and move there, which is what I read in the first few pages. We also follow Lydia in 1976 when she is a nanny in the house. They both realise that the longer they stay at the Reeve, the more deadly certain they are that they need to keep the children safe from whatever lurks inside. Filled with claustrophobia and dread, this novel will chill you to your core. I recently watched a horror film called Relic, which has some kind of claustrophobia in a house scenes, and I realised that would be kind of like my absolute worst kind of nightmare, the idea of being kind of trapped in a house. So yeah, I'm kind of anxious about reading this one, but very much intrigued by it. Then I try not to do this too often, but every now and again it's really hard to distill a blurb down, so I am just going to read you this blurb. And that is of The Fair Folk by Sue Bristow. Now I think this might be her second novel. I remember she had a previous novel out called, was it Seal Skin? And I was intrigued by it, but I heard it was kind of quite violent and brutal, so I didn't read that one, but I love the sound of this one. It's 1959. To 8-year-old Felicity, who lives on a dying farm in England, the fairies in the woods have much more to offer than the people in her everyday life. As she becomes more rooted in their world, she learns that their magic is far from safe. Their queen, Elfrida, offers Felicity a gift, but fairy bargains are never what they seem. As an adult, Felicity leaves for university. Unfortunately, books are not her only company at school. Elfrida and Hob, the Queen's constant companions, wield the ability to appear at any time, causing havoc in her new friendship and love life. Desperate, Felicity finally begins to explore the true nature of the fair folk and their magic. Her ally, the folklorist, Professor Edgerly, asks, "What do they want from you?" The answer lies in the distant past and in the secrets of her own family. As the consequences of her gift play out, Felicity must draw on her courage to confront Elfrida and make the right choice. Interwoven with traditional stories and striking characters, The Fair Folk poses questions about how we care for our children, our land, and our love-hate relationship with what we desire most. So, a couple of things I want to say here. When I was young, I was kind of obsessed with fairies and magic, also witches. At one point, I'd read every book about witches in the children's library. I used to just start from A and move my finger along, and any book that looked or sounded at all witchy, I would borrow. But I also loved fairies, and I was particularly obsessed with that film. Was it called Fairy, A True Story? Which was based on a true story. And I absolutely loved it and watched it time and time again. I need to rewatch that film. Also, another example of how much I love fairies. I once wrote a letter to the Tooth Fairy asking her what her name was. And my mum, obviously, not the Tooth Fairy, wrote back in the tiniest, cutest handwriting imaginable that her name was Lucinda, which I think was a brilliant fairy name. And I will still never know how my mum managed to write that small and that neatly. So yeah, I very much loved fairies, and I just think this book is going to be kind of imbued with those vibes. A lot of the descriptions I read of this one, like people's reviews, said that it has really beautiful kind of coming of age rural vibes at the start. And then when she's at university, it has really good kind of academia vibes. I think she might be at Oxford. So yeah, I'm just really intrigued by this one. I think it's going to be really different to anything I've read in recent years, but kind of reminiscent of things I loved as a child. Then I have Remote Sympathy by Catherine Chidgey. She is a New Zealand author, and I have recently read 2 of her books, Pet and The Axeman's Carnival, and really loved both of them. So I want to go back and read her backlist, and Remote Sympathy is the other one that's really accessible in the UK. It's a very chunky book. I've got a couple of kind of chunkier books on this list, and I've heard such rave reviews for this one. And I know a lot of people don't like to read World War I and II novels because they feel like it's kind of been done to death and it was a period they studied at school. I still do really like reading books about that time period and even about the interwar years, but I tend to be more interested in the people kind of on the side of the war, not the people who went into battles, but the people who were left behind and how they kind of had to persist with this new normal, which is kind of what this is about, but it sounds like a pretty upsetting book. So this is, like I said, a Second World War novel, and we follow this woman who is moved by her husband to a beautiful rural part of Germany in this lovely farmhouse to start this new life. And that's because he has a job working as a work camp administrator. Now, we all know that it is not a work camp. And she kind of lives this life and she loves this house and she's just very ignorant of everything happening around her. But then she falls ill and they send her a doctor who's one of the inhabitants of the camp to treat her, and they develop this kind of unlikely friendship, and she can no longer ignore precisely what is happening at the camp. It says a tour de force about the evils of obliviousness. Remote Sympathy compels us to questioning our continuing and willful ability to look the other way in a world that is enthralled to the idea that everything, even facts and morals, is relative. To be honest, I'd read anything this author has written at this point because I think she is an amazing writer and also just writes about such different topics but does so well. So yeah, really excited to get to this one, but obviously I think it's going to be a really difficult subject matter. Then we have The End of Drum Time by Hannah Pulvinen. This came out this year in the UK, although I think it's been out a bit longer in North America. This is a kind of chunky, epic historical fiction kind of love story. And my understanding is this is about a young Sami reindeer herder and the minister's daughter who form this kind of romantic bond in the 19th century Arctic Circle. I think this is going to be a wonderful wintry read because it says it immerses readers in a world lit by the northern lights, steeped in age-old rivals and guided by passions that transcend place and time. So yeah, I think this is going to be, again, really emotional. I think the writing about the weather and the landscape will be really beautiful. And I've read a couple of books now that feature Sami communities, and it's something I would like to read more about, so really interested in this one. And then we have the only one I actually own, and that is Haven by Emma Donoghue. I own it, I still haven't gone and got my copy, so I've put a picture up. So the rest of them are accessible via my library or via audio on Everand. If you are not a library user, I encourage you to be, because libraries have such great accessibility to books and I would not be able to afford to buy all these books to read, so my TBR would be drastically different if it wasn't for the library. And also, even if at first glance the library doesn't have the books you want, you can ask them to buy certain books. So out of the list, they don't own 5 of these books, and I've asked them to purchase them, and I'm sure they will because they very rarely say no to any purchase requests. So yeah, that's just a little celebration of the libraries because I love talking about them. So Haven by Emma Donoghue. I've read a couple of her books now. I think she's an absolutely fantastic historical fiction writer. I just love the way she writes, and I tend to audiobook her books because she's Irish and usually her characters are Irish and books are set in Ireland. Now this one is set in 600 AD, and I tend to find that stories like this set in this time period tend to kind of border historical fiction and fantasy a little bit because the beliefs were so different and the kind of connection to nature was so much stronger. But yeah, they kind of have this ethereal type vibe, which is something I really enjoy. This says it is a parable of patriarchy, destruction and religion at sea. Following a dream he has, this priest gets 2 monks to go with him in search of this place to worship. They find, after drifting out into the Atlantic, this really remote island that's just inhabited by tens of thousands of birds, and they claim it for God. It says this book combines pressure cooker intensity and radical isolation to a stunning effect. So yeah, I think this one is going to be pretty bleak, pretty taut and crazy. Like I said, I love reading books set on islands, in particular when people are having to kind of scrabble their way through when they're struggling to grow crops and things like that. And I also think books about isolation can veer kind of into horror, and that's something I'm really interested in. Then again, on the 24th of October, we have The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. I stumbled across this one. I'm so happy I did because just everything about this blurb sounds like catnip to me. I've never read any Andrew Miller and I really think I need to. So like I said, I'm going to read you the blurb. Also, I just want to say that all of the author quotes for this one sound amazing, but they're from authors I really adore who write really well about kind of rural living. So yeah. December 1962, the West Country. In the darkness of an old asylum, a young man unscrews the lid from a bottle of sleeping pills. In the nearby village, 2 couples begin their day. Local doctor Eric Parry, mulling secrets, sets out on his rounds while his pregnant wife sleeps on in the warmth of their cottage. Across the field, in a farmhouse impossible to heat, funny, troubled Rita Simmons is also asleep, a head full of images of a past life her husband prefers to ignore. He's been up for hours tending to the needs of the small dairy farm he bought, a place where he hoped to create a new version of himself, a project that's already faltering. There is affection, if not always love, in both homes. These are marriages that still hold some promise. But when the ordinary cold of an English December gives way to violent blizzards, a true winter, the harshest in living memory, the 2 couples find their lives beginning to unravel. Where do you hide when you can't leave home? And where in a frozen world could you run to? It says this is a page-turning examination of the minutiae of life, which is one of the things I said I love, and proof yet again that Andrew Miller is one of Britain's most dazzling chroniclers of the human heart. I mean, does that not sound absolutely brilliant? Then we have The Stranger's Companion by Mary Horlock. I stumbled across this one and I actually thought this was like one of those reprint editions of an older book, and it isn't. It's just been given a copy that makes it look like that, which I think is very fitting with the vibe of this book, because this is a kind of mystery set on an island in 1933, and I believe this is based on kind of a true story. So it says there was only 500 inhabitants on this island, nothing really happened there until one day the neatly folded clothes of an unknown man and woman were discovered abandoned at a coastal beauty spot. So people couldn't figure out how these people died, like have they been murdered, what's happened. And it brought lots of media attention to the island. And at the same time as the kind of media attention started to focus on the island, one of the inhabitants who'd been away in England came back, and she decided to be sort of like an amateur detective and to look into this. And it's about how tangled up she gets with this mystery and also the kind of intensity of all this media focus on the island. It says this is a compelling mixture of mystery, community, secret revealed, and ghosts from the past disturbing the present. So yeah, I think this one could be a real kind of cosy mystery, one I'm really looking forward to. Again, on the 24th of October, we have a new release, and that is that beautiful Atlantic Waltz by Maliki Talik. So last week I did a recommendations video for autumn reading, and I mentioned a book called The Valley at the Centre of the World by Maliki Talik, which I absolutely love, and just, yeah, can't think of many books that compare to it really. And after making that video, I thought I haven't looked him up in a while to see if he's got another book coming out. So I did, and he has on the 24th of October, and that is that beautiful Atlantic Waltz. This sounds brilliant. It says a rich and gentle book of small moments, large lives and hidden miracles, which just sounds wonderful. And this is one of those books that has a section in the past and a section in the present, which is something I really enjoy, you can possibly tell, because that's a feature of quite a few of the books I'm mentioning. 1957, Sonny is working on a whaling ship in the South Atlantic, again at sea, love that, reckoning with the most vicious storms he has ever seen. It's a brutal way to make a living. When he finally returns to his Shetland home to build a life with his wife and young son, the legacy of his time at sea is felt by all of them. In present-day Shetland, Jack is an old man living alone in the cottage where he grew up in the shadow of a hill. And it is here one evening that something appears on his doorstep, something that throws off the rhythm of his solitary existence in the most profound way. This is a story of unlikely friendship, longing, the power of music, and the pull of home. It is about a life revisited and reimagined. To be honest, anything that this author was going to write about, I was going to read, but the fact it's another book set on Shetland, and it's about like an older man, and there's elements of the book being like set at sea. Just can't wait. I feel like this is going to be one of my favourite reads of this year. Then we have Up Country by Chin Sun Lee. I don't think this is published in the UK, but I can access it on audio. Now this has a crazily long detailed blurb, which I don't really think gives a vibe of what this book's about based on reviews I've seen. In all honesty, I saw the cover and I was really pulled in, so I went and did some research into this one. And this one sounds like kind of remote living, slice of life, but also maybe a little bit dark and twisted, which are vibes I love and adore. It says this book is about three women, a middle-class ex-Manhattanite, a cash-strapped single mother, and a young member of an obscure religious sect, and they all become entangled in a Catskill town. Loads of the reviews said that this book was spooky and twisted, they couldn't put it down, they couldn't believe where it went. And it says it is about resiliency, despair, faith, distrust, identity and community. And that's kind of as much as I want to know, because I could tell from the blurb, it explains precisely how these women get kind of entangled in one another's lives. And I think at the centre of that is a house, which is something I always find quite interesting. I'm interested in reading a book set in this environment. I feel like it could feel quite autumnal. And yeah, I sometimes like going into a book with just a very basic premise of the location and the characters, knowing it's going to go some twisted places, but not really having a hint of what those could be. So yeah, really interested in this one. Have no idea where it's going to go, but I'm very excited to find out. Then, after hearing so many of you rave about it, I've added The Coast Road by Alan Murren to my list. I will of course be listening to this one on audio so I can listen to a beautiful Irish accent. So this is set in 1994 in County Donegal. And my understanding is this is about two women, one being Colette. She has left her husband and went to Dublin to be with another man, and she returns in order to see her children. And her husband won't let her see her children, he bars her access, and at the time, divorce isn't yet legal. So she isn't able to legally see her children, he's allowed to withhold access. And she develops a friendship with a woman called Izzy, who is a housewife and a mother of two. It says this is a novel about a closed community and the consequences of daring to move against the tide. I'm hoping, based on the title and cover, this is going to be a bit kind of windy and windswept and coastal. And also I feel like maybe, yeah, there could be some like kitchen table scenes. I love scenes of like domesticity where people are like planning the dinner and drinking cups of tea at the kitchen table. So I'm hoping we get some of that. I think this is a really interesting period to read about, and I understand that Alan Murren writes about these women's lives really well. Then I read Reservoir Falls by John McGregor quite a few years ago, and since then have meant to read his other books and just haven't gotten around to it. But his most recent book, Lean Fall Stand, sounds really wintry, so I'd really like to get to this one in the winter, because this follows an expedition that goes wrong in Antarctica. I've actually, like I said, read the beginning of quite a few of these books, and this one also really stuck with me because we follow the expedition from one man's perspective, I think called Doc, and this big snowstorm or blizzard kind of sweeps through the area. And it's so bad that they lose all radio contact with one another. There's 3 of them on the expedition, that they don't even know like how close or how far they may be from one another. So they're all too scared to move, and yeah, things go like drastically wrong. I think Doc is the only survivor of that expedition, and the majority of the book is you following his life when he returns. His wife becomes his carer because he's so ill because of this expedition, and he's trying to piece together precisely what happened. So I think a lot of the book kind of takes place in his head as he thinks back, and that kind of loss of knowing his time and place radically changes who he is. And I think, yeah, all of those are kind of really interesting things to discuss, and also, yeah, just absolutely terrifying. And his writing in Reservoir 13 was so beautiful, very slow, very detailed, really kind of luxuriated in nature writing. So I'm really interested to see how he writes about this kind of like brutal weather conditions, because I think he'll do it some justice. Then another kind of small town, slow family drama I would like to read is Fire Exit by Morgan Talty. This is already out in North America, but it comes out in the UK on the 1st of October. It says a lone white man lives beside the river on the edge of the Penobscot Reservation in Maine. Love reading about Maine. Charles spends his days doing odd jobs, looking after his depressive mother and staring across the water to the house in which his half-native daughter Elizabeth has grown up, unaware of his existence, her paternity hidden to protect her tribal status. Yet the cracks in the foundations of Elizabeth's life are beginning to show, and Charles can see Elizabeth is struggling, much like his own mother does. He firmly believes the truth will set them all free, but the price of it may be the destruction of them all. A deeply layered story of family and blood ties, full of quiet, beautiful and dignified sentences. Fire Exit shows us kinship from all angles and its capacity to break down, reform, fade or strengthen while always remaining a part of us. Yeah, I've just had really good things about this author's writing. I've wanted to get to his short story collection that was published a couple of years ago, but yeah, really want to prioritise this novel now. And then we have The Borrowed Hills by Scott Preston. It says, with foot and mouth disease spreading across the hills of Cumbria, 2 neighbouring shepherds lose everything and put aside their rivalry to join forces. They set their sights on sheep rustling from a wealthy farm in the south that has a prize-winning flock. This is described as, and wait for this, lyrical, cinematic and steeped in tales of heroism, machismo, moral intensity and myth-making. It's a love song to the landscape. It's gritty, gripping and fiercely committed. And this is being compared to like a Northern England Quentin Tarantino. So love all that, love books in rural settings. I think that all sounds amazing. And yeah, I think this is going to be one I will read with my heart in my throat, so can't wait. Next one is Birding by Rose Duran. I have no idea how I stumbled across this one, but as soon as I saw the cover, I felt really pulled in by it. I think it's a really well designed cover. And this was one of the samples that I struggled to stop myself continuing with. And the reason I did stop myself is because this book is set kind of at the start of winter, so I'd like to read it then. But yeah, just really loved this author's writing and felt really immediately pulled in by the story. I'm going to read you this small part of the blurb because I just think it is beautiful. In a small seaside town, autumn is edging into winter. Gulls ride winds over the waves and 2 women pass each other on the promenade as yet unaware of each other's existence. So these 2 women, one of them is a woman who was a really successful young pop star in the 90s. And in the wake of the Me Too movement, she's starting to look back on a lot of the decisions that she made or were perhaps made for her, and yeah, re-examine what that period of her life was like. And then the other woman is a middle-aged woman who still lives at home with her mother, and they have matching outfits and hairdos, and they have a really rigid routine that's decided by her mother. And she's just started to feel kind of flashes of anger and wanting to kind of break out from this life she has. And it's about what happens when these two women meet and how these sparks of anger they've both started to feel about choices that were effectively made for them, how they kind of combine and what happens after that. I love books set in tired seaside towns because I am from one. I think there is such kind of a tired decadence to those type of places. If you're not from England, I'll just mention that a lot of seaside towns were in their heyday in kind of the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of money was pumped into them, and they were the place to be. They were the place people wanted to move to because they were kind of like, you know, party destinations. But then, yeah, when people started to be able to afford holidays abroad, those places got very tired very quickly. They have very little money spent on them now. And so, yeah, they can look very dilapidated, very grey, and, yeah, very impoverished, basically. And I think it's a really interesting place to write about. And I cannot wait to dive into this one. Then I was over the moon to learn that Catherine Vermette had a new novel out. She is an amazing Métis writer. I have read her kind of interlinked trilogy of books, The Break, The Strangers and The Circle, which I always recommend, but just want to push again here. So I was in shock to learn that she has just had a new novel come out called Real Ones. And yeah, this is going to be hard for me to get hold of. Her books are always quite hard to get hold of here because they're not published. But as soon as I can, which will probably be a few months, I will be paying whatever I need to pay to get a copy of this shipped over to the UK, because her books have just always been 5 stars for me. I think she writes beautifully. And again, kind of slice of life, really focused on community and family life. And the books of hers I've read so far have always been set in Winnipeg. So it says, June and her sister Lynn are Indians, real ones. Lynn has her pottery artwork, her precocious kid Willow, and the uncertain terrain of her midlife to keep her mind, heart and hands busy. June, a Métis studies professor, yearns to uproot from Vancouver and move with her loving partner Cy and their faithful pup. June decides to buy a house in the last place on earth she imagined she'd end up, back home in Winnipeg with her family. But as this is all happening, their estranged white mother is accused of faking being an Indian. She is a very celebrated artist. She has won many awards with monetary value because of her work in the Indigenous art circle, and all of this is brought into question. And yeah, the sisters kind of get tangled up in this, and it forces them to revisit some really traumatic parts of their childhood. I think this is a really interesting topic, a really important one that's been discussed a lot in the kind of Canadian literary community. And yeah, I trust Catherine Vermette to do this justice. And even kind of outside of the central topic of this book, I just think the way the sisters' lives are initially described sound really kind of cosy. And like, I love when people have kind of made this kind of life of contentment and safety for themselves. I think that's a really beautiful thing and something I really like to read about, especially in the kind of colder and cozier months. And the next one is Greener by Grania Murphy. To be honest, all of this author's books sound ideal for autumn and winter, but I decided to start with this one because this is the one that kind of piqued my interest the most. So this is about 3 women who were inseparable as teenagers in high school, but then they drifted apart. And it's 25 years later and they've decided to book a holiday home and to kind of reconcile. But what they're not expecting is there is this big blizzard, which means they are trapped in this holiday home with one another for much longer than they imagined. And it says it is a beautifully crafted novel exploring care, loneliness, and the space required for bonds to strengthen. And yeah, I love the idea of a book being set in this house and then being trapped in it by the weather. I also really enjoy books that explore friendships from high school and how people change and the kind of different life decisions people make and how different they might be from the ones they plan to have when they're young, and how these kind of unsaid things can develop between friendships that have lasted this long. So I'm really interested in this one and excited to see where it goes. And then we have Moon Road by Sarah Leipziger. So I previously read Coming Up for Air by this author, which is a trio of voices that kind of form this collective theme that makes up a novel. And I thought that individually they were beautifully written, and I can still remember like whole sections of the writing, but I didn't think they really worked together as a novel. But I meant to look out for this author. And when I stumbled across this book, I just clicked on it because I liked the title and cover, and then I realised who the author was. And when I read the blurb, I was just like, oh my God, this sounds like a book I will absolutely love and adore. Can't wait to get stuck into this. This is being compared to someone like Elizabeth Strout and Barbara Kingsolver, which I think will make a lot of you want to read this as well. In this, we follow a couple, or a separated couple, who haven't spoken to one another for 19 years, not since what happened to their daughter, which we don't know. They get some news that forces them to take a road trip across the whole of Canada with one another. And it says, as they rattle over 2,000 miles in a pickup through forests, over mountains and into service stations, an alluring history reveals itself of fierce love, complicated ex-wives and headstrong children, and of a unique bond that never really went away. It says it captures the wonder and grief of watching our children grow up, of recovering from long-buried pain and rediscovering those closest to us when we think we know all there is to know, and of learning to live and love in a completely new way. And yeah, just all the quotes on this are amazing. It says this is melancholy, meditative, tragic, lyrical, just I am so excited to get to this one. I think it sounds like an absolute wonder. Now I have 5 autumnal, wintry sounding children's books, and I will mention that a few of these are published by Pushkin's children's imprint, which I think is really great, and so I highly recommend you go and check that out. I could have included way more books here, but I had to narrow this down somewhat. The first one is one I've had on my list for quite a few years now, and that is The Tunnels Below by Nadine Wild-Palmer. All of these have beautiful covers. The premise of this is that our main character on her 12th birthday finds herself lost in some tunnels below London that form a labyrinth. And it says that deep in the darkness of the labyrinth roam the terrible Corvus, tyrants of the magical world below. And she had to go on this kind of epic quest to save her family. Now I love kind of children's adventure books, but I think this sounds really distinct in it being set in these tunnels, so I think that'd be quite spooky. I also love children's books, and I read so many children's books when I was myself a child about kind of talking animal characters. But in the large majority of those books I read, the animals were friendly. And I think in this one, these crows are going to be mean. And so yeah, I'm really interested to see how that's handled. Then we have the adorable How to Be More Hedgehog by Anne Marie Conway. I had to include this one as soon as I saw that title, but also that wonderful cover. This is about a young girl called Lily who has a stammer, and a video of her practicing her class presentation is uploaded onto YouTube, and loads of horrible cyberbullying commences. And Lily is super unhappy, and she starts to think she's going to have to run away and go to move with her dad in Scotland. And it says it's about friendship, family and the courage to speak out. I think this is going to be really reminiscent of authors like Katya Balin and Jacqueline Wilson. So yeah, very excited for this one. I think it's going to be a lovely little read. Then we have The Witchstone Ghosts by Emily Randall Jones. This says it's a spooky gothic adventure, perfect for fans of Frances Hardinge and for curling up with on a rainy night, which sounds lovely. The character is called Autumn Albert, amazing, and she can see the dead, she can talk to ghosts. Her father dies at the start, but his ghost doesn't appear and she can't talk to him. Then in his will, he leaves this weird request that her and her mother move to this remote island in the cottage where he was born. But when Autumn gets to the island, she realises things aren't quite as they appear. Like, all the people who live there are really tight-lipped. There's barely any ghosts there. There's these weird witch stones. And yet she realises she's going to have to go on this kind of adventure to save the island before the waters rise and history repeats itself. So yeah, I think this is going to be another really sort of glorious adventure story, and I'm really looking forward to it. Then on the 10th of October, we have The 12 by Liz Hyder. This is an absolutely beautiful cover, I think illustrated by Tom DeFreston. It says it is supposed to be a treat for Kit, a winter holiday by the coast with her sister Libby and their mum. But when Libby vanishes into thin air and no one else remembers her, Kit is faced with a new reality, one in which her sister never existed. Then she meets Story, a local boy who remembers Libby perfectly. Together they embark on a journey beyond their wildest imagination into a world steeped in ancient folklore. Can Kit and Story uncover the secret of the 12 and rescue Libby before time runs out? It says this reads like a modern classic with echoes of Alan Garner, Marcus Edgewick and C.S. Lewis. So yeah, just think this one sounds like an absolute delight. Lastly, for the children's books, we have The Beast Player, another one that's been on my list for a really long time, and that is by Naoko Yushi, translated from the Japanese by Kathy Hirano. I think this is a duology, so if I enjoy this one, I can go straight on to the next. It says that Ellen's family care for the fearsome water serpents who form the core of the kingdom's army. And some of the beasts mysteriously die. Ellen's mother is sentenced to death as punishment. Her mum manages to sort of whisk Ellen off to safety on this island, and once there, she discovers that not only can she converse with the water serpents, she can also converse with the majestic flying beasts that guard the queen. Can she use this ability to prevent a war? As I said, I love kind of talking animals, especially if they're like magical, mysterious ones. And I've heard people say this is like some of the best children's literature written in recent times. So I think this is going to be absolutely amazing. We're on to the last 5, and these are kind of like cozy, fantasy, sci-fi type books. Firstly, Heart's Blood by Juliet Marillier. I still haven't read this one. It is one of her few standalones. It is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. I think this one might be YA, I'm not sure, but I've heard amazing things about it. It's one of her kind of most highly regarded books. And it says that Whistling Tor is a place of secrets, a mysterious wooded hill housing a crumbling fortress of a chieftain whose name is spoken throughout the district in tones of revulsion and bitterness. And we follow this young scribe who, rather than kind of being forced to go there in the traditional story that we know, chooses to go there because she is running from her own demons, and she kind of views this place as a place of safety. Then we kind of follow the traditional story of Beauty and the Beast. As with all of Juliet Marillier's books, her stories involve the Fae. So yeah, I assume there will be some rather nefarious Fae characters in this one. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this one. Another one I'll be audiobooking. And then we have A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. This came out a few years ago and I was really intrigued by it at the time, but I thought I'd wait for reviews because I've had real bad luck with kind of contemporary fantasy. I think this is now a duology. And based on the reviews, I think I'll really enjoy this because a lot of people complain that it's way too slow. And that is something that does not really bother me in fantasy. So I'm hoping I'll really enjoy this. This is another book that's kind of imbued with the world of the Fae. It's set on a remote island called Cadence. And we follow, I think, a group of 4 characters. But the 2 main characters are these enemies. This bard is called back to the island of Cadence where he grew up and hasn't returned to for many years, because a string of girls have gone missing and they think it could be to do with some dark Fae that are at work on the island. So he's called back to kind of help investigate. And it says that this book is an alluring and rich tale, which I think sounds glorious. Then we have, this is a bit unusual for me, Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. As I said, interested in fairies. This is kind of like a cozy fantasy romance, which isn't usually my vibe. But I just feel like I want to give it a go because I feel like I could really love this. I don't often read kind of romance books, but sometimes when I do, I really do just feel really happy reading them, and I'm hoping that is the vibe this book and the rest of the series will give me, because it says this is a darkly gorgeous fantasy that sparkles with snow and magic. And we follow this woman called Emily Wilde, who is a lead scholar on the Fae folk, and she is invited to this village to do some research. And yeah, she really struggles with socialising and with people. And she runs into this other academic, this very handsome man who is kind of her rival in the world of academia. And they have to work together on this Fae-focused investigation. And it's about, yeah, what might happen after that. We all know what's going to happen. It's cozy, so they're going to end up in love. But I'm sure there'll be lots of antics on the way there. And then lastly, I have a sci-fi, which is quite unlike me. I always intend to read more sci-fi, never do. But again, I struggle because a lot of sci-fi is very fast-paced, but based on the reviews, some people are complaining that this was a bit too slow for them. And yeah, when I read the first few pages, I quite enjoyed the tone of this one. It is a sci-fi mystery about a mission into deep space that begins with a lethal explosion that leaves survivors questioning the loyalty of the crew. Our protagonist, Azuka, is the only surviving witness, and so she becomes a suspect. And it's about her trying to kind of prove her innocence as they move through deep space. And in the opening section, what I thought was really interesting is one of the things about them living on this spaceship was that there wasn't much space for the whole human population. And so they all wore this kind of virtual reality headgear, which made them feel like they were walking somewhere like with much more space. And she liked to walk in an area that looked like a kind of cozy forest. And so even though this is set in space, it had the kind of elements of cozy fantasy that I really like to read. So yeah, really intrigued by this one, as I am by all of these books. So that is all 35 books I've put on my autumn and winter TBR. I would love to know if you've read any of these, if you've added them to your list. I would love to know if you have any books on your autumn and winter TBR. Yeah, just everything you want to say down below. And I just wanted to mention that if you are interested in supporting me and helping me out, being able to spend more time doing videos like this, then I do have a Patreon. It's $1 a month and you get access to 4 free videos. We also have a Discord where we chat. And so I'd really appreciate if you're able to do that. It's always linked down below. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.